efforts of every single Queenslander and of course our health workforce. That leaves us with 30 ongoing active cases for a total so far of 1,149. We tested 4,933 people in the last testing period. I was asked yesterday how many active cases were in New South Wales, and the wind was too strong for me to shuffle my papers. So I'm advised there are currently 145 active cases in New South Wales. In the last reporting period, the last report from Victoria, they reported 7 deaths. That is more deaths in one 24-hour period than Queensland has experienced throughout this entire pandemic. But in good news, they do appear to be getting their cases under control. I understand that from midnight tonight, their restrictions will ease, the curfew in Melbourne will be reduced, and people will be allowed additional exercise. I just say that both to recognise how well Victoria is doing, but also to underline the contrast. You know, a lot of people in Queensland might not feel like this pandemic is a real threat, but if we hadn't managed to keep those cases out, if we hadn't managed to contain that second wave largely to Victoria, then we wouldn't be able to go about the freedoms that we have now. We certainly wouldn't have our economy operating at the level it is now. We wouldn't have businesses open and people in jobs as we do now. And so it's just so important that we continue to take the health advice. Regardless of the pressure that is put upon us, we continue to take the health advice so that we can keep Queenslanders safe and at work. There's been a lot of commentary recently about who should make these kinds of decisions, whether it should be politicians or whether it should be advised by medical experts. As you might imagine, the Medical Association has a view, has a policy on this, and so I'd like to welcome Chris and Bav from the AMAQ, who can both speak to that, and then we're available for questions.
Thanks very much, Minister. I'm Chris Perry, I'm the President of the AMA in Queensland. Look, the AMA in Queensland, we have a very, very straightforward policy. We believe in the science of the Chief Health Officer. We believe that Queensland should follow the advice of the Chief Health Officer. And if she says the borders should stay closed, we think they should stay closed. It's very simple, very straightforward. We're an evidence-based organisation, so we follow what the Health Minister says, sorry, what the Chief Health Officer says. Thank you. Do you want to add anything further, Bav?
Thanks everyone. My name is Bav Manaharan. I'm the Vice President of AMA Queensland. I guess the question we want all Queenslanders to really ask themselves is, do we want more people at funerals or do we want more COVID funerals? I think this is something we really need to be thinking about. As a health professional, myself, Dr. Perry, all of our members, and Dr. Jeanette Young, we're inherently compassionate people. We have to be. That is part of our oath. So we really need to say, what are we really weighing up here? Are we weighing up the interest of the tourist industry and other industries, or are we looking at the health of Queenslanders? The AMAQ strongly supports and stands by the Chief Health Officer, Jeanette Young. We think she's done an extraordinary job in a very tough time. Happy to take any questions.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes. We are concerned about another wave. Victoria is a very stark demonstration of what can happen if we do lower our sights too quickly. We have seen a lot of quite personal attacks on our Chief Health Officer. She's a woman. She's very highly qualified. The stress is on her, and all we can say is back off. We think this Chief Health Officer is doing a great job. Of the Chief Health Officers of Australia, she is probably par excellence. She is probably the one they look up to the most, and leave her alone. She's doing a good job. We support what she's saying and doing.
Obviously, I think one of the big reasons she got the big criticism was about those comments about letting people in because of getting the economy going. Do you think that what she's trying to say there has been taken out of context?
Yeah, I think it has been. And thanks for feeding me with the words there. Thanks, Shannon. But I actually agree with that sentiment precisely. We, as Bav has said, we would prefer to have fewer funerals than have more people at those funerals. We support what she's doing, and we think people should back off from what she's and leave her alone.
Is she hurt by the criticism this week, later in the week? People said today, mate, you haven't spoken to her first?
I speak to Jeanette every now and then. We know each other from previously. I know she is under stress. Queensland Health has given her more support in staff, take the pressure off. There's a lot of people asking for exemptions from quarantine or a different way of doing quarantine. And she's been very fair with that. It hasn't just been footballers and wealthy people. She's been listening to people all the way through and giving exemptions when she can, when it is safe for the rest of the state to have those exemptions carried through. Yes. Like all people these days, it's mostly online trolls. I know the federal government has a different point of view about borders. We don't want to get into that. We follow what the Chief Health Officer says, and we'll leave it alone at that. But it's mostly been online people, the bullying which occurs in social media these days. I know the Chief Health Officer gets quite a bit of that.
There's obviously chief health officers across the country, and they also have their branch of the AMA. How can there be such inconsistency? You guys back other states back. Obviously, other states are going to be agreeing with their chief health officer.
The state you'd be talking, the one state you're talking about is Victoria. The Chief Health Officer in Victoria doesn't have the same level of support, doesn't have the same level within the Victorian Health Department that our Chief Health Officer has, isn't backed up by legislation guaranteeing her independence, and that what the Chief Health Officer in Australia says, Chief Health Officer in Queensland says is it goes, it's the law.
We've seen the opposition, I guess, intimate that the Premier is making all of these decisions. Do you stand by the fact that it's actually the Chief Health Officer making these decisions, not the politician?
If you had the Premier and the Chief Health Officer in the same room, you'd get lots of opinions. They're both very strong women, and I'm not privy to those conversations, but they would talk things through, and by the looks of it, they agree. And 6 deaths in Queensland, it carries through that we're doing a very, very, very good job in this state, probably because we've got Queensland government, our politicians in Queensland, listening very carefully to a very well qualified physician.
What I meant by that is
The exemptions are the Chief Health Officer. Yeah, it's not the Premier. The only danger is if the Chief Health Officer can't do her job and look after the health of Queenslanders. It's not dangerous if people leave her alone and she maintains her strength, which she will.
Saying that you invited here today by the government to speak, or did you
No, we were asked whether we'd support the Chief Health Officer. We said yes, this is our policy. And Bav and I are representatives of a large organisation, and our policy comes through from a council of over 20 physicians from around the state. So our position is very straightforward, and we want to support the Chief Health Officer. We're not here to support governments, we're an apolitical organisation. Well, it's a political discussion, and people, especially our political representatives, are entitled to have a point of view. So they can put their point of view to the health officer, and she can take their points of view and work through on the science as to whether what they're saying is valid or not.
Let's ask you.
So, yeah.
We've obviously got doctors here today to say that they're the people who should be making a decision about borders. What will you make of these airlines coming together, an airline that's based here in Queensland, and also these major travel agents coming out today and saying, they're going to make it a political campaign to have borders open?
Oh, look, these businesses and their chief executives obviously have a right to further the economic interests of their companies, but the government has a responsibility first and foremost to take care of the health and the jobs of Queenslanders, and that's what we'll continue to do. Can I just say, if the boss of Qantas wanted to do more and show compassion for Australians, then he wouldn't be gouging them tens of thousands of dollars just to come home. He would be working with the government to get them home rather than attacking us on the front page of the paper. I don't have any updates on that, but we have gradually been expanding that team. There's now 80 staff there. The last increase was when we put that team of 8 clinicians in to consider health requests from people in New South Wales. As far as I know, Queensland is the only state that has a dedicated unit of clinicians dedicated to taking care of the healthcare needs of people from another state. I think that demonstrates just how seriously we take those responsibilities. We deliver healthcare to nearly 1,000 people from New South Wales each and every week without fanfare. It just happens within the system. We deliver great care to those residents, particularly of northern New South Wales. No, I don't have any update on genomic testing of that. I'd emphasise that sewage testing is it's very early stages. It's really useful, but it's very early stages. It's considered research more so than screening. The subsequent, while there was a confirmatory test that was also positive, confirming that it wasn't a false positive in the first place, subsequent tests have come back negative, suggesting that if there was whatever was the cause of that positive result in the first place had probably moved on. If you don't mind me just checking my notes. It's not windy today. Linked to the Brisbane Youth Detention Centre, we now have 23 cases, and linked to the Queensland Corrective Services Academy, we now have 25 cases. We do consider those 2 clusters to be linked, although we can't confirm for sure exactly what the link is. So that means in total 48 cases just from that one. And I think it serves to emphasise just how quickly these things can get out of hand if we don't have the resources to allocate to them. At one stage, Victoria was dealing with 300 active outbreaks, 300 active clusters. That would have put enormous pressure on our health system, but because we haven't got that, because we're dealing with 1 or 2 clusters at a time, we're able to deal with it and get them back down to where we have 0 days like we have today and we did on Thursday. Yes, it does. I'll have to get Lydia for you some information about which of those 2 numbers include the Ipswich Hospital cases.
So before the PM declared that municipals across the country open the direct exchange from saving lives to saving putting the economy ahead of vehicles.
I had some pretty strong words to say about this yesterday. I think what's really clear is that the LNP at both a state and federal level are running a campaign to get our borders open. Let's not forget that every state has some kind of border restrictions in place right now. The New South Wales border is close to Victoria. Victorians aren't permitted to travel. So there are borders in place right around the country. I mean, the one thing I would agree with the Prime Minister on is I'd like to see the borders open too by Christmas, but only if the health advice says that that's safe, not just because of a political campaign from the LNP, not just because it's what Scott Morrison wants. I want to see them open too, but only if the health advice says it's safe. And I think the real question here, the real question out of all of this is for Deb Frecklington. If she were Premier, who would she be listening to? She seems to be saying that she wouldn't be listening to the Chief Health Officer, that she'd be making these decisions herself without the advice. Does that mean that she would just open the borders even if the Chief Health Officer said it was unsafe to do so? They're really important questions, and I think Queenslanders deserve an answer to them.
No. Yep. It does seem an awful lot, 30 people in one suburb or one council area in Melbourne, but I think Melbourne's got about 15 of these council areas. So does that mean 1,500 cases in Melbourne is fine? before it becomes a hotspot, or 1499, 1470. Thank you.
Concerned are you that an outbreak could easily happen again if someone was allowed to go to even came from an area where there was no COVID? Are there cases where we just don't know whether that place has had COVID yet or that person could be contracted?
It's beyond my pay grade. I'd leave that with the Chief Health Officer. Yeah, we do feel sorry for the funeral things. You know, the young lady and her father and the crematorium certainly touched everybody's heart. But at the same time, on that day, I spoke to a friend of mine who's 73, who could put out 2 words on one breath in an intensive care unit in Melbourne, and I don't want to see that happen to people around me either. Thanks, Mav.
Could I just make a quick response to your question around hotspots? So the AMAQ doesn't have a position on what a hotspot should be defined as, but what we do want is to see the definitions across the country become standardised, because that's causing a lot of confusion. When we talk about hotspots, we're not talking the same language as New South Wales, as Victoria, so unless there's a national consensus, that's going to cause a huge issue. I can't comment on whether it's delayed or not, but it's certainly been an important step to looking at opening the borders, because unless you're on the same page and you're talking about the same numbers and statistics, which is defined by the terminology, it becomes very difficult to progress, really. So that's part of that plan. It should be if it isn't. Absolutely. The Minister or the Government's probably better poised to answer that, but our understanding is that with the Chief Health Officers meeting quite regularly, the National Cabinet, there is an open source of information being shared. And if it wasn't, it absolutely should be. But our understanding and understanding of AMAs around the states is that that collaboration is occurring.
Yes, sir. We've got to keep our distance, though.